I want to start with an analogy that I think will help us later today. So imagine, if you will, back in the Wild West. We're back there, and the sheriff of your little town comes to you one day and says, look, this town's too big for me to handle on my own. I need to make you my deputy. So the sheriff deputizes you, gives you a little badge, and now you have some of the authority of the sheriff to exercise the law on his behalf. Right? The sheriff's still in charge, but you're his deputy. I actually think that's one of the best analogies to understand what's happening in Genesis chapter 1 when God makes humanity in his image. What does it mean to be an image bearer? He goes on to say in that chapter to go and rule and subdue and to help lead the earth. God is the one in charge, but we're like his co-rulers, his deputies, sent out with this new calling, this vocation. Now, we as humans, we abdicated that job almost immediately. But that was our original calling. What it meant to be an image bearer was to be God's deputies, taking on some of God's authority and actually exercising his will, his justice on his behalf. So I was thinking about that idea of becoming deputized, and it brought me back to the first moment where I ever got called on to preach. This was back, I was a student at UC San Diego, and in our Christian fellowship, we had a weekly service. We had a band, we had some worship music, and then a speaker would come up and give a sermon. One of our regular speakers was one of my good mentors and friends, this guy Ryan. And so I remember one Wednesday night, he finished his sermon and went to sit down. In our rhythm, our tradition, the speaker would usually finish, would go sit down, the band would come up and play one more song, and then the speaker would come back up and for about 6 more minutes give a public altar call, a chance for the congregation to respond publicly in faith. So anyway, Ryan sits down right next to me in the front row, and all of a sudden I feel him lean over, and he taps me on the knee, and he says, hey, why don't you go ahead and take this altar call? Yeah, like just imagine you're me. That was not in the plan. That was not in the night's agenda. I was completely blindsided about that. But I also had this moment like, oh, Ryan believes in me. It's like he's passing on the mantle, giving me the baton right here in this moment. So I guess I have to do this. And so, I had never done this before, but I've sat through enough altar calls. It's really just, you have to share the condensed message of the cross that we've been talking about through 1 Corinthians. You got to talk about the good news, focus on the cross, and invite people to respond publicly in faith. And so I literally had about 3 minutes until the end of that song to muster up some courage, to pray a lot, and then to walk up on stage and give my first ever altar call. And actually, by the grace of God, a couple students actually stood up that night to start a journey of faith with Jesus. And I think even beyond that, God used that moment to grab a hold of my heart and said, hey, you are built for this. You're going to be telling people about Jesus for the rest of your life. But that was kind of the seed got planted right there that night. And it was, especially thinking back, it was a moment where I was being deputized, not just by Ryan, but by God, to say, you were called into this kind of vocation. So with that, keep that idea in mind as we come back into 1 Corinthians. We're going to be in chapter 2, starting in verse 6 today. And this series that we've been working through, Paul's letter to the Corinthians, the Corinthian church is so much like our situation today. Especially here in California, in the Bay Area. Corinth was this huge metropolis that had a little bit of everything. Every culture, every lifestyle, every religion, everything was kind of meshed together in this big port city. And so as the Corinthian church is navigating, how do we be the people of God and witness to our culture? I think that's a great question for us as Grace Hill to keep asking week after week. So just to catch us up to speed, for the last several weeks, what Paul has been doing is laying out this message of the cross, the foundation of what it means to be a Christian. And he's been saying, well, the world does it one way. They have a particular definition of power, of strength, of wisdom. But the cross turns everything on its head. The message of the cross, and in chapter 1, he says, it's foolish, it's weak, it's scandalous, it doesn't make any sense. The King of the universe dying a shameful death on the cross, and yet somehow it's actually the power of God. It puts to shame the so-called wisdom and strength of the world. And so it's giving us this new perspective as Christians. Say, how do we How are we formed and shaped by this strange message, the message of the cross? Last week, as Pastor David led us through the first part of chapter 2, Paul then is sharing how he is embodying that message in his own life and ministry. He says, I came to you in weakness. I didn't come with eloquence and great wisdom, but I came resolved to know nothing but Christ crucified. And so we're going to keep going on today. And in verse 6, it's kind of like Paul pulls back the curtains. In chapter 1, he's been using this upside-down rhetoric, and he's calling the message of the cross foolish and weak and powerless. But here he says he's pulling back the curtains, saying, what I really am saying is it's the actual redefinition of power and strength. The message of the cross is the strongest, most powerful thing God has ever done, even though the world can't see it that way. And so let's jump in. It's such a dense passage. We're going to look at just 3 verses today. Let me go ahead and read it for us. Paul writes, yet among the mature, we do impart wisdom, although it's not a wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are doomed to pass away. But we impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. None of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Let's focus in on this message. Verse 7, right there in the middle, the secret, hidden wisdom from God. And some have been tempted to read this as if Paul has in mind almost like 2 tiers of Christians. You know, if you come for the first time and you walk through the doors, then we tell you the public message that sounds nice and it's for everybody. But if you stick around long enough, well, then we invite you back into the inner sanctum. We give you some secret passwords, and there's actually a secret message that only the really mature Christians get to know about. That's not at all what Paul's talking about here. There's no 2 tiers of Christians. When he says the secret hidden wisdom of God, hidden before the ages, he's talking about the message of the cross, Christ crucified. And the point here is, up until Jesus, through all of world history, nobody expected that this was the answer. To all of our problems, to the problem of sin and death and suffering, nobody expected that the answer was Christ crucified. And so it was a mystery hidden before the ages. But now Christ has come. He has died. He has risen. It's now a mystery that's been unveiled for everybody. The message of the cross is for everyone. That's the message, no matter how long you've been coming to church. There's no 2 tiers of faith, of Christians. It's like, I keep thinking of when I proposed to Melanie, some 18 years ago now. And, for several months, I had this plan brewing, and I only let in a few people into my plans that I kind of needed to help me make the plan happen. But I made sure Melanie had no clue. Day of, she had no clue that was the night that I was going to propose. It was a mystery. It was a secret. But once she said yes, and I put the ring on her finger, well, then we want to tell everybody. It's no longer a secret. That's what Paul is getting at here with this secret hidden wisdom. He says the message of the cross, again, is what he's talking about. And then he talks about the wisdom of this age, the rulers of this age. If they had known what they were doing, they wouldn't have crucified the Lord of glory. One of the tips I want to share about reading Paul's letters in particular, Paul, earlier on in the letter, he will often give a really dense statement that he then unpacks throughout the rest of the letter. And so I think this is one of those moments. These 3 verses are packed with so much idea and so much history and so much depth, and it's a little daunting. But if we keep reading through the rest of the letter, which we'll do over the coming months, we'll find moments where he kind of unpacks this. He does this in Romans. He does this here. And so he's kind of condensing all of his big idea, his big thought into a few short words. But what is he talking about? The wisdom of this age, the rulers of this age. When Paul refers to rulers of the age, he has in mind the human rulers who are actually governing and leading the land. He also has in mind the spiritual, darker powers and forces behind that. Like Paul talks about principalities and powers in other letters, where there's the spirit of the age might be animating or influencing our human rulers. And so what he's saying here is all of it, the spiritual realm and the human realm, conspired together to crucify the Lord of glory. Specifically, the current leaders in Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin of the Jews, and then Pilate, who represents Rome, and they killed Jesus on the cross. And you would ask, well, why did they do that? I think a simple way to explain why they did that is because Jesus was a nuisance. He was starting a movement and overturning their status quo. And so they thought, well, Jesus is like that biting horsefly that won't go away. If we can just squash him, then we can go back to our lives. And so let's kill Jesus, and then his little merry band will disperse, and we can go back to our ordinary lives. That's what they thought they were doing when they crucified Jesus. Little did they know that they were actually signing their own death warrant. The crucifixion of Jesus unleashed a power into the world that completely changed everything. For 2,000 years now, if you take Jesus out of history, I can't think of a single area of our society that would be unchanged. He changed everything. And he did it by dying on the cross. Just to add a little levity here for a minute, this week I saw an illustration, a cartoon going around online. And it was a comic, a picture of all of the Marvel superheroes. So, you've got Spider-Man and Captain America and Thor and Iron Man. So they were all sitting in a circle around like a campfire around Jesus. So Jesus was sitting there with all of the Marvel superheroes. Can you picture that? And it was Jesus talking, a little speech bubble coming above his head. And he simply says, so anyway, that's how I saved the world. And I loved it. I kept going back to that because it's such a great juxtaposition. Because here, our culture right now is enamored with these superhero movies. We keep making more of them for 20 years now. We must have spent billions and billions of dollars creating these superhero movies. And I'll admit, I love them. I've watched all the Marvel movies. I love those. I love them. But there's one thing that all these superheroes have in common. At the end of the day, they save the world with the world's version of power, of strength, and of wisdom. Sure, they go through their own character arc, and they need to learn humility and sacrifice, but at the end of the day, it's the superhero with the strongest punch or the smartest strategy or the fanciest gizmo that defeats the enemy and saves the world, right? And so that the irony of seeing Jesus sitting and talking to all of these superheroes and saying, hey, the way I saved the world is I let my enemies kill me, and actually it defeated them. Like, it doesn't make any sense, but that is a great picture of, okay, here's how the world would do it, but this is how Jesus did it, and it completely changed everything. Or to take us back to Rome, why would Rome kill the Lord of glory? The Roman Empire was the strongest empire the world had yet seen. They had the strongest army. Nobody could defeat the might of Rome. Every army that tried failed. And yet, in just a few hundred years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, by all intents and purposes, Rome fell, not by the sword, but by the cross. Even historians, both Christian and non-Christians alike, look to Christianity as ultimately one of the main causes for the fall of the Roman Empire, at least the Roman Empire that we knew in the first century. And they didn't pick up a sword. They didn't come up with a stronger strategy or a greater battle plan. They defeated the might of Rome by dying for their enemies. They defeated it through humility and grace and sacrifice because thousands of people saw the love and the grace coming from these Christian communities, and they started to convert to Christianity by the thousands, so that the whole foundation of the pagan way of life crumbled. You could go many different ways with this, but even just to think of some of the culture of Rome, when they looked at Christians, they thought, these Christians are ridiculous. Their values are not actually values, they're vices. We take things for granted today. So, for instance, humility. Both in the secular world and the religious world here in the West, we value humility of some sort in our leaders. When our leaders are overly arrogant and prideful, we don't like that. That was not the case in Rome. They did not see humility as a virtue at all. It was a vice. And so then these Christians come along and they started to lead through humility and sacrifice. They thought, this is ridiculous. It's upside down. This is not. It was reprehensible to the Romans. Or the idea of taking care of the weak, taking care of those who can't take care of themselves. The Romans thought, well, it's a dog-eat-dog world. If you're weak, then you should just be left to perish. The Christians, throughout even in these first centuries, when there was an epidemic of illness, of plague, they were the ones that would rush into the epicenter of the problem and start to take care of the sick at the cost of their own lives. The elite Romans could just ditch out of town and wait until the plague was over, but the Christians would rush into the epicenter. And because they kept doing things like that, thousands and thousands of people kept converting to Christianity. So they defeated the Roman Empire because they took on the form of the cross. They started to give of themselves, self-sacrificially, in so many different ways that you could go back to verse 8. I like to think of, Pilate. Pontius Pilate was the governor of Rome, representing Rome, and maybe a part of his mind is thinking, well, Jesus is kind of a nuisance, and maybe if we kill this would-be king, his whole movement will stop and we can go back to our daily lives. Little did he know that by crucifying the Lord of glory, he was putting a ticking time bomb on the whole might of the Roman Empire, right? That's what Paul is referring to here, when none of the rulers of this age understood what was really going on. So that's the big picture Paul's been laying on in this dense passage here. He's telling this big story to say nobody expected that this was the answer, that the king of the universe would take on the lowest form of our humanity, would die on a cross, and that would actually be the strongest, most powerful thing God has ever done. That's how God saved us from our sin, from our suffering, from all of it. Nobody expected that, and that's the big picture that's going on here. But I kind of started talking about that image of becoming a deputy. Because actually embedded in this passage, it's not just a reminder of the big story that God is doing and we're just sitting here learning about it. There's actually right in here, God is inviting us to be a part of that story. He wants to deputize each and every one of us to step back into that original calling God has for humanity. We're supposed to be his partners, bringing his will, his kingdom to the earth. And it hinges on this interesting phrase at the end of verse 7, for our glory. Let's talk about that one for a little bit. For our glory was puzzling for me, because I have a general idea of what it means when we talk about giving God glory. We sing about that all the time. We talk about that as Christians. We give God glory, okay. But every once in a while, the Bible turns it around and talks about God giving you glory or glorifying you. And isn't that kind of strange? What does that mean, God giving me glory? And I want to say it has more to do with our vocation than our salvation. Let me break it down. The word glory used throughout the Bible is used in a couple different ways. And one of the main ways here is worship and obedience. So I give glory to God when I worship him, when I make his name more important than any other name in my life, when I give him honor and praise, I'm giving God glory, right? I give God glory when I obey him, because his commands are the best possible way to live, and when I do that, I'm giving him glory. So that kind of makes sense. But if we reverse that, it doesn't really work, because that's not how God gives me glory. God doesn't worship me. God certainly doesn't obey me. Praise God. So that's not actually the category. But throughout the Bible, when it talks about God glorifying us, I think the best synonym would be this next slide, authority to rule. When God gives us authority, in the Bible's terminology, he's giving us a sort of glory. When the sheriff comes to you and gives you that badge and makes you his deputy, to use the Bible's language, he's giving you glory. Now, we don't use it quite that way today, so it's a little confusing. But almost if you just made glory a synonym with authority and you replaced the word glory with authority in certain cases, it might make more sense. So I summed it up on the next slide. So we give God glory with our worship and obedience. God gives us glory with authority and calling. It's not on the same level at all. We're not being worshiped. We're not being placed above all other names. None of that. It's simply a synonym for authority to rule, right? And then 1 Corinthians gives us a sharper definition of that. Paul is saying that the way that we are called to co-rule, to become his deputy, is not to lead with the values of the world, but to lead looking like the cross. Paul says the message of the cross is everything. It's our entry point. The way that we are saved and enter into this life with God is through Jesus on the cross. But it's also the shape of our life. We have this cruciformed calling. And so the calling is not to go and lead with the world's power and strength and wisdom, but to lead with self-sacrifice, by emptying of ourselves with love and grace and humility. And that's the way for the last 2,000 years that these small communities of Christians throughout the world have changed everything. It's not always been the big, flashy names, the famous people throughout the ages that have done a lot of great things that we write about in history books. It's the smaller communities of faith, the grandparents for 2,000 years who have prayed every single day for their grandchildren to come to know the Lord. The small communities of faith that have surrounded the widows and the orphans and those that were sick and taken care of them and visited them. It's that kind of work, this slow march of God's kingdom. And it's been Christians who have taken on this shape of the cross that have changed the world. But what I think Paul in Scripture is inviting us to think about is that is the way that God has redeemed our original calling. The first humans were told, you're my image bearer, go and rule and steward the earth. And then we abdicated that job right away. And now, through the cross, God says, I still have that calling for you. You're still called to be my deputies, to be sent out and bring my kingdom and my will into the earth. But the way you're going to do it is through the cross. The cross is what saves me. It's also what shapes me in my everyday life. How do that's, I think, what Jesus means when he says, take up my cross every single day to follow me. How do we shape our lives like the cruciform Messiah? I want to land this with some words from Jesus. When he goes through this, he dies, he rises, and then he meets with his disciples for one last time, and he sends them out with a very similar message. It's at the very end of Matthew. We know this is the Great Commission. And listen to Jesus' words, especially in light of this topic that we're dealing with today. He says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go, therefore. Right there, that's Jesus deputizing you. Jesus says, I'm the one with the authority. I'm the one ultimately in charge. It's through Jesus' death and resurrection that I've accomplished all of this. So he grounds us in that. But then he says, go, therefore. He's giving us the badge. We're his deputies. We're sent out with some of his authority to bring his will, his kingdom into the earth. Go, therefore, and do what? Make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. Behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. That the command maps perfectly onto that definition I said of how do we give God glory. We give God glory by worshiping him and obeying him. And that's what Jesus then calls us to go and teach others to do. How do you worship God and obey him with all of your life? And this is a whole extra sermon here, so I won't go too deep into this passage, but just one observation that I love about Jesus' Great Commission. The beginning and the end is all about Jesus. He starts with the foundation. It's my authority. I'm the one that died and rose from the dead, and so it's my authority, and now I'm sending you. And then he ends by saying, and I'm with you always. He doesn't say, hey, go out and figure it out on your own, in your own version of power and strength and wisdom. He says, I'm going with you. Let's go do this together. We're partners in this venture. So let's go. I'm with you. Let's proclaim this incredible message of Christ crucified in both our words and our lives to the whole world and see what happens. So that's how Jesus sends us out. I want to close with this reflection, just thinking, how can we respond to this message today? And there's probably two main ways for our group today. One, I talked about how the cross, the message of the cross, is our entry point. It's the way that we ourselves, personally, are saved, are redeemed. We receive that grace from God. Nothing that you did can earn that. It was by God's grace alone, because he looked at you and he loved you. And so there may be some of us here that say, you know what, I haven't even taken that first step. I haven't received God's grace for my own life. And so the invitation for you is, well, how can I step into that? How do I begin that journey with Jesus, receiving that grace that he gave me? He accomplished on the cross so that I could be saved and forgiven and set free. If that's you, I would just love to invite you to come and talk to me. I would love to pray with you, answer any questions, and explore what does it look like to start this journey of faith. And then for those of us who say, I've received that, I believe that, I've received that salvation, but I don't know what this means about being his deputy. Does God actually send me out? He doesn't want us to receive this salvation and just remain passive. We're not just spectators. God says, hey, let's go do this together. You're my partner. I've called you for a purpose. And so what does it mean to step into this incredible vocation, to live a cross-shaped life in our community, to share this message with our family, with our friends, with our coworkers, and to be this light of God's grace and truth for the rest of the world? How can we participate with God in that? And so that, for us this week, maybe to reflect, are there ways, God, that you're calling me to live this cross-shaped life in my community, to proclaim Christ crucified with someone tangibly in my life? Maybe ask God for a name or a face right now. Are there ways that God is asking us to sacrifice something, to pour ourselves out in a way with extreme generosity or love or grace with someone specifically in your life this week? Because this message has changed the entire world. And for me, it's like the incredible news that I can never get over is it would be one thing if God just did that and it was like a movie I get to watch every once in a while. But God says, and I want you to be a part of it. Like, what? That is the most incredible part of this whole thing for me. Not only did Jesus save the entire universe, he then looks at every single one of us and says, you have a role to play in that. So let's partner together.